Nobody would have believed security guard James without the video footage. Over the past few months at the mortuary, he'd grown accustomed to the unsettling stillness of the dead. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough to keep his bills in check. Besides, James was a skeptic, not the type to scare easily. Yet what he experienced on that fateful night shook his very core, leaving him with questions he could barely fathom. It all began during the quiet hours of his shift. A storm raged outside, the sound of thunder echoing through the empty halls. James was making his usual rounds when the coroner arrived with a body in tow. The young woman had been pronounced dead just hours earlier and was brought in for an overnight autopsy. That, in itself, wasn't unusual. What stood out was the coroner's behavior. The man, typically stoic and methodical, seemed uncharacteristically anxious. He avoided eye contact and barely spoke. When James offered to help transfer the body to the autopsy room, the coroner hesitated before nodding. Together, they wheeled the stretcher down the sterile, dimly lit hallway. The woman's pale face was partially obscured by the sheet draped over her, but James caught a glimpse of her expression. She looked almost peaceful, as though she were merely sleeping. Once they reached the autopsy room, the coroner turned to James and said, "Take your break. And, stay away from the cameras for this room tonight." James blinked. "Why? Did something happen?" The coroner's lips thinned. "Just don't." The abruptness of his tone left no room for argument. James nodded and walked away, but his curiosity was piqued. Why the secrecy? The coroner had never given him such an order before. James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Instead of heading outside for a smoke as planned, James made his way back to his security booth. He sat down, the multiple screens in front of him displaying live feeds from various parts of the building. Against his better judgment, he selected the feed for the autopsy room. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The coroner busied himself with preparing the tools. Knives, clamps, and other surgical instruments were neatly arranged on the table. The young woman lay motionless on the cold metal slab. Then something strange happened. The coroner froze, his hands hovering over the instruments as though he'd suddenly remembered something urgent. Without a word, he left the room, his movements hurried and almost frantic. James frowned. He waited for the coroner to return, but minutes ticked by with no sign of him. Growing uneasy, James checked the other cameras and spotted the coroner exiting the building entirely. The man got into his car and drove off, leaving the mortuary eerily silent. "What the hell?" James muttered under his breath. His first instinct was to call the coroner and demand an explanation, but a more pressing thought took hold. The body. Why had the coroner left in such a hurry? And why had he been so adamant about James staying away from the footage? His heart pounding, James decided to investigate. He made his way to the autopsy room, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The air felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just his nerves. When he reached the door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Taking a deep breath, he turned the handle and stepped inside. The room was exactly as it had appeared on the screen. The woman lay on the table, her arms resting by her sides. James approached cautiously, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the room. He kept a safe distance, not wanting to tamper with anything. Then, as he turned to leave, he noticed something that made his stomach drop. Her arms, which had been lying flat moments ago, were now slightly bent at the elbows. "No," James whispered, shaking his head. "I must be imagining things." But the nagging doubt wouldn't leave him. He backed out of the room and hurried to his booth, determined to review the footage. Sitting down, he rewound the recording to the moment just before he entered the autopsy room. What he saw made his blood run cold. The woman's arms moved. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, they shifted, bending at the joints. It wasn't a random twitch or spasm, it was deliberate. James's hands trembled as he switched the feed back to live footage. To his horror, the autopsy table was now empty. The woman was gone. Panic set in. He scanned the other cameras, searching for any sign of her. In one feed, he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow darting across the hallway near the storage room. Grabbing his flashlight, James bolted out of the booth. He knew he should call the police, but something compelled him to confront whatever was happening firsthand. The halls were unnervingly quiet as he made his way toward the storage room. Every creak of the floor beneath his feet sounded deafening. When he reached the door, he paused, his flashlight shaking in his grip. Slowly, he pushed the door open. The room was dark, the faint hum of the refrigeration units the only sound. James swept his flashlight across the rows of shelves, his breath catching when he spotted her. She was standing at the far end of the room, her back turned to him. Her hospital gown was torn, revealing pale, bruised skin. James opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. As if sensing his presence, the woman turned around. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, and filled with something James couldn't quite place: fear, confusion, or perhaps rage. Blood trickled from a gash on her forehead, and her lips moved soundlessly as though she were trying to speak but couldn't. "Ma'am," James finally managed, his voice trembling. Are you okay?" She took a step toward him, her movements jerky and unnatural. James instinctively stepped back, his heart pounding. "Stay where you are, I'll call for help." But she didn't stop. Her pace quickened, her arms outstretched as if reaching for him. James turned and ran, slamming the door shut behind him. He raced back to his booth, his mind racing. This wasn't possible. People didn't just come back from the dead. He dialed 911, his fingers fumbling over the buttons. When the dispatcher answered, he blurted out the story as best as he could. Unsurprisingly, they were skeptical. "Sir, are you saying a dead woman is walking around the mortuary?" the dispatcher asked, her tone laced with disbelief. "Yes, I have video evidence. Please, just send someone." Reluctantly, they agreed to send officers to the scene. James watched the cameras anxiously, tracking the woman's movements. She wandered aimlessly through the halls, occasionally pausing to look around as though she were searching for something. When the police arrived, James met them at the entrance, his face pale and his hands shaking. "She's still inside," he said, leading them to the security booth. He showed them the footage, and their skepticism quickly turned to alarm. The officers drew their weapons and entered the building, James following close behind. They moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. It didn't take long to find her. She was in the main hallway, her head tilted to the side as though listening for something. "Ma'am, stay where you are," one of the officers commanded. The woman turned to face them, her expression blank. Then, without warning, she lunged. The officers tackled her to the ground, restraining her as gently as possible. She thrashed and screamed, her voice hoarse and guttural. "Get an ambulance," one of the officers shouted. James watched in stunned silence as paramedics arrived and sedated the woman. She was taken to the hospital, where doctors discovered the shocking truth. She hadn't been dead at all. A car accident had left her in a state of catalepsy, a rare condition that mimicked the appearance of death. The attending physician at the scene had made a grave mistake, declaring her deceased without thorough examination. The coroner, it turned out, had suspected something was amiss but hadn't wanted to involve James until he was sure. His sudden departure that night was an attempt to contact higher authorities discreetly. Unfortunately, his actions left James to confront the situation alone. In the weeks that followed, James couldn't shake the memory of that night. The woman survived, though she had little recollection of the events. The mortuary implemented stricter protocols to prevent such errors in the future. As for James, he resigned from his position. The job had always been unsettling, but now it felt unbearable. He often thought about the woman and the horrifying mistake that nearly cost her life. It served as a chilling reminder of the fragility of human perception and the thin line between life and death.